Because Victober is next month, I thought that I would go through my favourite Victorian novels with you. I've picked my 16 favourites, and these are dominated by two authors who I'm sure if you've been around this channel for a bit, you could probably guess. But I bet you can't guess the third author who is represented multiple times. Just quickly, if you don't know, Victober is a readathon dedicated to reading Victorian classics. It happens every year during October, and this year it is hosted by 5 great booktubers: Katie from Books and Things, Kate Howe, Roz from Scallydandling About the Books, Melissa from Blatantly Bookish, and Petra Yu. Just quickly, before going through the novels, I think that it's best to define what a Victorian novel is. For the purposes of this video, it is a novel published during the reign of Queen Victoria and published in England, Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. That is a country she was queen of. Now, to be honest, I'm not too sure what I think about naming periods after the monarch of the day. Has the Elizabethan era just come to a close? Also, I'm pretty sure the Irish have complex opinions and feelings about an English woman being labelled queen of their country. Before we get into an argument about war and class division and Sinn Féin, the whole point of this is to say that I won't be including any books translated into English or by American authors or anywhere else in the world. I may make a separate video to discuss my favourite French classics at some point, because the French do have some very good classics. 16. Kidnapped, Robert Louis Stevenson. This was my favourite book as a young teenager, which also happens to be the last time I read it. But do I remember being excited turning the pages of this novel? Yes, I do. I think 14-year-old Scott may have been the target audience Stevenson had in mind, but I think adults can enjoy this adventure novel as well. Set in the year 1751, 6 years after the Jacobite Rising, it centres on the Appin murder. David Balfour is 17, his parents are dead, and he is out to make his way in the world. He makes his way to his uncle's house and finds evidence that his uncle's house should really be his. His uncle then does what any caring Victorian family member would do in such a situation. He arranges for David to be kidnapped. David comes into contact with Alan Breck Stewart. So if you've studied your history books, you would know he was a central player in the Appin murders. I haven't studied my history books, and as such, I have no idea how to correctly pronounce Appin. But when I asked a genuine Scottish person how they pronounced it, they said, "Stop mincing our language, you daft Antipodean bampot." And like a lot of Scottish dialects, that isn't particularly phonetic. A rarity among Victorian novels, but not among Robert Louis Stevenson books. This novel is relatively short, coming in at only 136 pages, and most of those pages are made up of the book's full title. Kidnapped, being memoirs of the adventures of David Balfour in the year 1751. How he was kidnapped and cast away, his suffering in a desert island, his journey in the West Highlands, his acquaintance with Alan Breck Stewart and other notorious Highland Jacobites, with all that he suffered at the hands of his uncle Ebenezer Balfour of Shores, falsely so called, written by himself and now set forth by Robert Louis Stevenson. 15. A burglary, Amy Dilwyn. Heiress Essel Carton has had her prize jewels stolen, and a local poacher is blamed. But we know he is innocent. The real culprit is Sylvester, and he falls in love with our protagonist, Imogen, who only really loves collecting butterflies and creating havoc with her twin brother. There's a bit of a love triangle going on, and everything leads to a high-stakes farce. This novel is a comedy, but it has social commentary. There's a crime, a romance. It's almost as if Dilwyn wasn't sure what genre she wanted to write in and then said, "I know, I'll jolly well write in them all." 14. Silas Marner, George Eliot. I don't think there's anything I really like better than a cranky old man who ends up loving a child. Silas Marner is that cranky man. He counts his money every night, but one day he finds a little girl on his doorstep in the freezing snow, and he takes her in. This is a really remarkable book because at its heart it is just a simple coming of age story. But it also includes a character who's addicted to opium, a discussion of theft and honesty, and when you think about it, it's not one but two coming of age stories. This is another short Victorian novel that packs a punch. 13. The Return of the Native, Thomas Hardy. Eustacia Vi dreams of big things like going to Paris. She wonders if her lover, Damon Wildeve, will ever take her there. But Damon loves another, Thomasin Yeobright. It's a love triangle. But then Thomasin's brother, Clym Yeobright, returns from, guess where? You've got it, Paris. It's a classic Hardy love rhombus. But Hardy adds in Diggory Venn, the Redder Man. This mysterious guy sells Redder, which is basically red ink you put on sheep, which seems like a relatively niche industry, but whatever. Diggory also likes Thomasin. It's a love pentagram that includes siblings. It's a bit fucked up. There are twists, misunderstanding, lies, distressed women, horrible men, melodrama, tragedy, characters with really inventive names, commentary on class, and a heroine whose name begins with the letter E. Yeah, that's legit a thing Hardy does in a lot of his books. This book has 2 endings. The final book, I know having books in them is a confusing thing the Victorians did. I'm glad we're over that. The final book is a later addition from Hardy in response to criticisms the public had about the novel being too dark. Who did the public think that they were reading anyway? North and South, Elizabeth Gaskell. Margaret Howells moves to Milton after her father leaves the church for ethical reasons. In Milton, she starts to develop 2 very different types of feelings. Those of compassion for the mistreated working class, and those towards John Thornton, a man who employs many of the working class. It is a Jane Austen meets Emile Zola kind of novel, Pride, Prejudice and Germinal. Gaskell is very even-handed here, showing both sides of the argument, but is anybody going to give Margaret the advice she so clearly needs? Never fuck a Tory, Margaret. Because I'm talking about books, I just automatically assume that Tories aren't watching this. Number 11, The Odd Women, George Gissing. This is probably the most feminist novel I have ever read where the author is a man. In Victorian England, there were 1 million more women than men. Once all the men were paired off, the women left over were known as the odd women. A lot of these women were not expected to get jobs. Even if they did get jobs, it was for considerably less money and there were fewer job opportunities. As a result, a lot of these women lived in poverty. Now, there is a review of this from George Orwell, which says things more succinctly than I could. There is not a single major character whose life is not ruined by having too little money, or by getting it too late in life, or by the pressure of social convention, which are obviously absurd but cannot be questioned. In each case, the ultimate reason for disaster lies in obeying the accepted social code, or in not having enough money to circumvent it. Number 10, New Grub Street, George Gissing. It's a double shot. The truth be told, I find it very hard to pick my favourite between these 2 Gissing novels. A truly underappreciated Victorian author. This is a novel about 2 things, literature and money. Grub Street was an area of London well known for publishing hack literature. Edwin Reardon is talented, but his work has poor commercial prospects. His friend, Jasper Milgrove, is hard-working but cynical about his writing, and he is financially driven. Reardon is tempted to write trash. His wife pressures him to earn money, but what will writing trash do to his career? Milvain is involved with a woman, but marry her? She's poor, and the best thing for his career is to marry somebody with money. How much will Reardon suffer for his art? Number 9, Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte. A classic by anybody's standards. In 1801, Mr. Lockwood visits Thrushcross Grange. His landlord, Heathcliff, is also his neighbour, and he visits Wuthering Heights and has a ghostly encounter. He becomes our narrator, but he's not fond of Heathcliff and knows almost nothing about the events that he is narrating. Instead, he finds Nellie Dean and is repeating her story. Nellie is an important figure in the story who has her opinions on the people that she is talking about. But at times in her narratives, she is telling you what stories Kathy has told her or any of the other characters. But Kathy is another clearly biased character. At times, we don't have one unreliable narrator, but three. It certainly gives you something to think about and consider when you're reading this book. Often billed as a love story between Kathy and Heathcliff, it is really a story of obsession, power, and toxicity. It is not a love story. And it's not a book to give to squeamish readers either. It is a book I really do recommend waiting to read until you have read a bunch of other classics first. It's certainly not the entry drug people make it out to be, but it is a very good book. Can you believe that I've gotten through half this list without mentioning one truly chunky Victorian novel? Well, that stops now. Number 8, Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. I want to quickly mention a small gripe I have with this novel. It should be called Gwendolen Harleth, not Daniel Deronda. Gwendolen, for me, is the star of the book. And the book starts with Gwendolen meeting Daniel. Daniel watches Gwendolen win big on the roulette table before losing all of her winnings. The next day, Gwendolen receives a letter saying that her family is financially ruined. Gwendolen pawns her necklace so that she can try the roulette table again, but Daniel redeems it for her. The plot follows each character separately. Gwendolen is looking for a husband while Daniel is an orphan and is discovering something interesting about his family's past. This is a wonderfully complex novel. It has so many themes, it has character growth, and it contains a much more positive description of Europe's Jewish population than many, many other books of the time. At number 7, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Thomas Hardy. Michael Henchard is not a nice man when he's drunk. And while drunk, he sells his wife Susan. Yeah, I said that. He sold his wife. And their daughter Elizabeth Jane. Now the next morning he's quite remorseful and swears off the drink, but he is unable to find his wife. He eventually decides to settle in Casterbridge where he becomes mayor. 18 years later, Susan seeks out Michael again. This is a divisive Hardy novel. Many Hardy lovers do not love this. So while I think it's a fantastic novel, it is a novel I wouldn't recommend starting with. Hardy is known for writing some really horrible men. And don't be confused by his role as the protagonist of this novel. Henchard is one of those horrible men, even if he is slightly less horrible by the end of the book. This novel shows you his inner workings and his quest for redemption. It is a character portrait of horrible toxicity. In fact, it is quite similar to Wuthering Heights in that respect. Number 6, Far from the Madding Crowd, Thomas Hardy. Bathsheba Everdeen might be my favourite character in literature. She is strong yet vulnerable, pig-headed yet pragmatic, determined but capricious, independent but desirous of a husband, but not too desirous. She is intelligent but very, very stupid. She is a balanced character, and as the novel progresses, she grows. Bathsheba inherits a farm and tries to make a go of running it. She hires a man to help her with the farm who has a crush on her. She flirts with her neighbour and gives him the wrong impression, and she might just love a former army man. It's another Hardy love rhombus, but for it to work out, it does require that one of the couples be a little bit gay. And while we have this typical Hardy romance story, we also have this story of this woman trying to prove herself in the farming business. This is one of Hardy's least miserable novels. As a result, it's a lot of people's favourite Hardy novels. But please notice that I said least miserable novel and not happy. Number 5, Vanity Fair, William Makepeace Thackeray. Just by the way, 1847, what a magnificent year for literature. Vanity Fair and the debut novels for all 3 Bronte sisters. Becky Sharp is a determined young woman who is moneyless. She wants to make her way in society, and after finishing school, she lives with her friend Amelia Sedley, a woman who is everything Becky isn't. Becky meets 3 men: Joe's, Amelia's brother, George Osborne, Amelia's betrothed, and William Dobbins, a man who loves Amelia secretly. Becky makes a pass at Osborne, flirts with Joes, and generally causes a mess. Told in alternative sections, focusing on our two protagonists, Amelia and Becky, their lives drift apart and come back together. And this all plays out in the background of the Napoleonic Wars. As a result, this book is often badly compared to War and Peace. If you want to know what this book is about, you just have to look at the title, Vanity Fair. It is a fair of vanity. 4. The Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde. A novel of many layers. We have this gothic story about a man who doesn't age, but his portrait does. All of the horrible things he does to the people around him and the corruption of Dorian, featuring Henry and Basil as the evil conscience and the good conscience. Then we have Wilde making a discussion about pride and vanity and the value we place upon youth and beauty. And then, this novel is gay as fuck. I love when novels do this sort of thing. You can just enjoy the storyline, or you can analyse this novel to pieces, or you can do some sort of combination that's halfway in between both. This is the sort of novel that I will always be in the mood for. A super trashy horror novel that is super interesting with hidden layers. Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy. Jude is a young boy who dreams of going to university. A boy who always has his head in a book, learning Greek at a young age. But Jude belongs to the working class. Will he get to go to Christminster, Hardy's name for Oxford in his novels, by the way? Arabella thinks Jude might be a bit of all right. He's upwardly mobile, and she sets out to marry him. She tells him she's pregnant, marries him, leaves him, and emigrates to Australia. In the meantime, Jude is no longer studying the classics. Jude moves to Christminster, where he meets his cousin, Sue. If you have read enough Victorian classics, you'll know that cousin can also mean lover, spouse, bride, or groom. The only problem with this is that Sue is married to another man. The scandal of it all. Actually, that's just the start of the scandal. This is Hardy's darkest and most miserable book. It can be read as very critical of the church. Although Hardy seemed to never like that, it is likely that Hardy was just trying to save face. Anyway, the criticism of this book led to him retiring as an author of prose and becoming a full-time poet. Number 2. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Thomas Hardy. I've often said on this channel that Jude is my favourite Hardy novel. That was until I read Tess for the second time last year. This is the book that got me into Hardy and is the book I recommend as the ideal starting point if you want to try him. Tess Durbeyfield is a young lady from a not very well-off family, but her father thinks that they used to be called D'Urbervilles and sends Tess off to the D'Urbervilles. And this is where she meets Alec, a man who I think is the most horrible of all the horrible men Hardy writes. Alex rapes Tess, and Tess is henceforth ruined. Of course, everybody blames Tess, and Alec is fine. Tess then finds work as a milkmaid, where a gentleman angel Claire is learning how to farm, and romance ensues. But Tess feels she should tell Angel about what happened between her and Alec, and what will happen when Alec returns. This is a powerfully feminist novel which I love, and it's often depicted as a love story which is just wrong. Number 1. Middlemarch, George Eliot. Middlemarch, a study of provincial life, is quite probably the best book ever written in English. Originally, this novel was 2 separate unpublished novels, one focusing on Lydgate and one on Dorothea Brooks. Eliot was not confident in her work and was distracted by her mother-in-law's illness and subsequent death. Eliot decided to combine the work into one novel, and it creates something really unique. The characters of Dorothea and Rosamond don't meet until the end of the novel, and despite never being in the same scenes, they add so much to each other's stories. Without either one, the novel wouldn't work. The characters are in many ways the opposite of each other, but what the public thinks of one is true for the other. We see so much gossip in this novel. I'm not sure if the character of Fred was originally part of the Lydgate story or if he was a later addition, but he really is the icing on the cake of this novel. While all the substance of the novel is in Dorothea and Rosamond and the men in their lives, Fred provides us with so much comedy and insight into provincial life. A feminist novel that explores gossips, ideas around marriage, money, debt, doctors, religion, death, friendship, loves, widowhood, and so much more. It is everybody's second favourite genre, historical fiction, yet it was so successful at what it's doing, it is hardly thought of as historical fiction. It was written at the time of the Second Reformation Act was passed, and it was written about a time where the First Reformation Act passed. And that is because the government is also a major theme in this book. It has all the charm, comedy and criticism of an Austen novel, yet it is as complex and it forces you to empathise with the characters much more like a Hardy novel. It contains a Dickensian villain, and yet it has the structure and literary heft of the Bronte sisters. Well, two of the Bronte sisters anyway. That is my favourite 16 Victorian novels. Did I miss your favourite? Let me know in the comments. And if you're still here and you got a book recommendation from this video, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Bye bye.